Hey guys, what's going on? This is Campo and welcome back to my channel. So on today's video, as you can see, I have 100% 7.1, which just came out. I did not do a Legends run, but I did complete it in about 2 days. And I really had a good time with this content. And if you've been following my channel for a couple years, you know that I do kind of go into hibernation every once in a while. But in this case, when new story content comes out, I usually get a little excited and try to make guides. So that's what we're going to do today. Now, the structure of this video, the way it's going to work, I'm going to start off with just my overall thoughts and tips and observations. Then I'm going to go quest by quest and answer what I consider some of the frequently asked questions and also go over certain boss fights. Now, listen, I've made guides like this before on just one single quest that have been like 45 minutes long. So I'm trying my best to kind of keep this thing streamlined. And I would like to say that unlike Act 6, a lot of what we've seen so far in Act 7 and 7.1 is that in general, like if you know the game and you have a decent enough roster, you can kind of read the nodes and figure it out for yourself. So that's why I'm going to kind of skim over some of the nodes, but there are a couple of fights that might take a little bit extra thought, and I do want to kind of go over those. I will be putting timestamps in the description, which will help you kind of navigate each quest if you're looking for specific questions. And anyway, let's get into it. So starting off, just my overall thoughts. It was really fun. I do think, however, that if there's any criticism, it's actually going to be that it was too easy. But my counter argument to that is that to remember that this is sort of like the main story content. It's sort of the progression content. And what you want it to be is anybody that's been playing the game long enough and has the appropriate level champions, regardless of the RNG that they've had in the selection of those champions, if they're ranked up, they should be able to tackle the content. And I actually would be interested in the game continuing this trend where the story content is more manageable for the average player. And then you can keep the difficulty up in stuff like Variant and some of the side quests that are a little bit more difficult, and certainly like the Everest content like Abyss of Legends. So as long as we don't see a dumbing down of like all the content, I actually really enjoyed that this one was a little bit more straightforward and it still had really good rewards, but it did take a little bit of thought and practice. So my first tip is a little bit less of a tip, but more of an observation. And it's sort of like, well, how do you tackle this content? There's, in my mind, there's sort of like two ways, or you can blend them. And the first way is sort of old school Act 6, which is just bring Ghost, bring the synergy team. I think it's the path of least resistance is to just use Ghost and her synergy team for just about everything. Like I didn't calculate, but probably like 90% of this entire chapter can be ghosted. And I think, like I said, if you're going for speed or legends, that's the way to go. But for the first time in a while, they've created content where basically your whole roster can get through it. And that's sort of what I did. I had a goal of trying to use every single champ that I had that was 565 or over. And I pretty much met that goal. Like, I seriously think the only champ that I didn't use was Aegon, which kind of cracks me up because he's considered one of the best skill champions and is needed for Abyss. And I actually just forgot to use him because there was no time that I really needed him. So if you do it that way and you kind of read the nodes, then you will get to use some of the champions that you may have ranked up for defense or you ranked a long time ago and they haven't seen the light of day in a while. And I think that's really fun. Additionally, I think they improved on what they started in the 6.3 boost system that they created. That was a little bit of a clunky system that wasn't fully fleshed out, but in this time, they buff classes on the nodes themselves, and they really do open up the possibilities that you can use with your roster. So obviously, if you want to use Ghost and you're a good Ghost player, it will be the easiest way to do this quest. But also, if you want to pick some choices that are a little bit more on the edges and not as often seen, you can totally do that as well. Now, one example of that is one of the final bosses, which is called Spider Witch. And she's one of the mashup champions. And the three things you have to deal with are potentially being poisoned, that she will evade, and that she also has inverted controls. And so, you know, you could totally ghost that fight. But actually what I did was I brought Emma Frost and Mysterio, who basically the two of them have a synergy that will allow you to counter all of that, the poison, the evade, and the inverted controls. And so even though the fight took a little bit longer, I have both those champs ranked up. and it was really fun to actually get to use them. Now, similarly to talking about Ghost, I do want to just briefly mention that if you are a Quake player, Quake will work for almost the entire quest, but the fact that she is not available as a 6-star, it's starting to be noticed to me because the HP is getting quite large, like with bosses over 600 HP, and I really 600k, and I just feel like quaking for that long is doable and sometimes necessary, but I would say that we are starting to see the beginning of the 6-star takeover, and Quake may get left in the dust a little bit, but she does work for a lot of it. So next up, we're going to kind of go over some quest mechanics and sort of how they work and what you need to think of. First of all, if you have 6 stars, rank 2 and rank 3, they get lots of buffs. Not only do they take less damage because of adrenaline and the boost to adrenaline, but they have an attack boost throughout the entire thing. Your rank 3s are going to hit super hard. Like, I even found that Elsa Bloodstone and Silver Surfer, who are 2 of my rank 3s, were just like hitting exponentially harder than any of my other champions. Even though they aren't the top champions in the game, they were super, super fun as rank 3s. And similarly with rank 2s. So basically, if you have 6 stars or a 6-star version of a champion and a 5-star champ, I would definitely err on the side of using your 6 stars. It'll be a little bit easier. Next up, we're going to talk about the champion switch. At the end of every quest, you have the ability to switch out a champion as long as they're alive, and even if they're only at 1% health, you can switch out this champion and get a champion at 100% health from the remainder of your roster. Now, this is very, very good for like picking a boss killer or a synergy piece at the end of the quest. And I just want to briefly compare this to 6.2.5, which had like the total opposite vibe going on. In that quest, you were required to bring 4 of the same class and a boss killer, and then for the Mordo boss, they all had to still be alive. Whereas in this one, there's only 6 fights. There's no restrictions. You get through the lane. If you want to swap in a boss killer with someone that's almost dead, you can, and you don't get punished. So they've really sort of like done a 180 when it comes to the quest design, particularly when comparing it back to there. There are multiple bosses, which I thought was pretty fun. We will go over some of the bosses later, but in general, I liked that because I do like to get a second chance at the boss. Like, sometimes you learn a lot the first time you fight them, and then you want to go back in with like a little bit better strategy, but having to do the same boss 6 times is a bit of a drag, and it was really nice to only have to do it twice. And final comments, there was a little bit of MCOC nostalgia for me. Like, I got to use my blade a few times, and there were the mashup champions from the original MODOK event, which was really cool. And also there were some scenarios where we got to use Ronin cheese technique, and you know, that is classic MCOC right there. It really brought back a lot of those old quests when we wanted to do that. So yeah, overall, I had a really good time with it. And now we're going to go quest by quest. All right, so we're going to start with 7.1.1, and this is a very straightforward quest. Like, I'm actually not going to even go over that much, but the only thing that I wanted to point out is sort of like I said in the intro, like if you have half a brain and you just read the nodes, you're going to kind of figure this out yourself without someone telling you what to do. And I am going to show a quick graphic of something related to this can't stop, won't stop path, which is like, don't be that guy, guys. Like, I just think you need to be able to read and figure it out yourself sometimes, because there's can't stop, won't stop, and there is the additional node called Muscle Wizard, which basically lets all of your Mystic champions be able to have Unstoppable. So you have like a million options there. And similarly with this Cosmic Fracture node on the lane right down here, because this will allow all of your cosmics to break the armor and not have to deal with the thorns. So, you know, this is an example of like, you don't need someone to kind of tell you how to do this. You can just sort of like choose your own adventure with your roster. So again, there's not much to say here. We're going to move on after I just briefly explain the Black Widow Deadly Origin boss. It can be a little bit of a tricky fight, especially when you read this node if you don't know how it works. But essentially, the way this works is you want to just sort of parry her, and she's essentially stun immune. And then after you build up a bunch of charges from doing those well-timed blocks, you dash back and she gets stunned for like a really long time, and then you can do a ton of damage during the stun. So if you're a little worried about this fight, you may want to bring shock immune, like Dr. Doom, for example, just so if you slip up and you get shocked from one of her evades, You don't have to take that extra damage. And also I would recommend practicing your re-parry technique, because she does have those double mediums. It's a little tricky to keep getting the well-timed blocks when she's stun immune, but you can get off several well-timed blocks if you know how to re-parry. So that's how to take care of her, and other than that, it's a very straightforward quest. So moving on to 7.1.2, this could potentially be one of the harder quests overall, because there are some paths that are a little bit more difficult, and there also are some bosses that if you aren't sure how to counter them, you might get into trouble. So there is a destructive feedback lane, which that came back from one of the 6.2 quests, I believe. And there's nothing too difficult about the node itself, but there is a Daredevil Hell's Kitchen on it, and a lot of people haven't learned to fight him yet. So I'm going to put on in the background, I actually took Sabretooth to fight him. I just decided to have a little bit of fun with one of my underutilized champions, because he does get a buff when he procs Armor Break and Bleed, which is kind of nice. He gets even more fury. So yeah, you don't really need a specific counter for this, but I'm just going to show the footage so you can kind of see how to bait his specials. And in general, when countering this node, you just want to kind of like alternate special ones with each other, so that you don't have to worry about making contact and worrying about taking the damage back. So yeah, a lot of people have asked about that, and I would just recommend not trying to ever parry him because he can shrug. Just alternate special ones and you should be fine. There is another path that has Vivified, and it also has the Power Suppression node, which is going to help your science champions. So basically the way this works, Vivified is like huge increase to combat power rate and no way to control the power. However, with this enhancement to your science champions, when you throw a special attack, you put an Enervate on them. And then kind of like with Gwenpool, anytime you have a debuff on them, as the Enervate is expiring, it will refresh. So you want champs like Captain America Infinity War who have lots of debuffs so that they will continually refresh the Enervate. And once you get the champion under 1 bar of power, you can just like totally lay into them with that Enervate. The only thing to worry about is there's also Power Alternator. So if you gain too much power, you're also going to feed them power when you alternate power bars. So you do need to throw your special attacks. And as you've seen in the background, Human Torch is a really good option for this lane. You can just spam heavies in the corner and keep putting those incinerates and refreshing the Enervates. It's a really good way to deal with this, and he works for pretty much all the fights, especially because there's a couple mystics on the path. But really any science champion that has debuffs, like even Luke Cage I was thinking of, could probably handle this path. Vivified is usually pretty annoying, but this really helps it. Now let's just talk about 2 of the bosses. There's a Green Goblin boss who has the node that's called Redlining. And basically, this gives like a power combat rate increase, but as soon as you hit 75% power, which is like a little bit above 2 yellow bars, then you will drain all your power. So if you are throwing your specials, you want to not get too high in your power bar or you're going to get in trouble. And I'm going to throw a clip in the background that was sent to me by Tafre, one of my alliance mates and another YouTuber, of Hulkbuster just totally wrecking this fight, because it also has power reserve, and with the additional node, you can basically just like continue to spam specials, keep them stun locked and all that. Another good counter is Magic. She can spam special 2s forever, and you're totally fine with that. And also, I would recommend checking out Metal Sonic Dude's channel, because he has a Tigra solo, which is like super skill-based and totally possible as well. The other boss that's a little tricky on this map is the Rhino boss. And he has this new node called Tantrum, as well as Power Shield and Bubble Shield and Matador. So the way Tantrum works is every time you hit him, he gets these charges on him. And then when you knock him down with a special attack or heavy attack, you take a ton of direct damage. So the first champ that comes to mind is Namor, because he will not have to deal with that damage back. So he's probably the best. But if you continue reading the node, you will realize that if you can put some specific debuffs on him, like Taunt or Concussion, for example, then you will be able to bypass this node completely. And I'm going to put a clip in the background of Emma Frost totally handling this fight because on her special 2 knockdown, there's a concussion play. So she will never take the damage back. And because of Matador and Power Shield, it kind of plays into her abilities. She'll be getting that special 2 a lot. And yeah, that's another example of like using a champ that you wouldn't necessarily think of for this fight. But I did find that Emma was quite good for it. So that's going to kind of wrap up 7.1.2. Moving on to 7.1.3. I actually thought this was the easiest quest overall. I just want to give a quick mention to some crazy node designs. Blaze is like Flare, the node where you get additional attack, but on steroids. And yeah, you will degen a ton, and it's got Power Shield, so like you can get off these massive special attacks. As you can see, Corvus just like destroying this Joe Fixit here. And there was another node that had Gimme and Life Transfer, as well as Spectre. And, you know, this is cool because there was a really annoying Gimme Spectre fight that was in, was it Venom the Duck maybe? It was in one of the late Act 6 matchups, and it was like a really difficult fight. But the fact that they added Life Transfer to it just makes this like a totally crazy fight because they will take damage on everything you regen. So while the Spectre timer is going, you just want to kind of like not hit them. And then when Life Transfer kicks in, you will just be dealing a ton of damage to them. Shout out to Weapon X. If you do have him as a trophy champ, he's immune to Spectre. So he will actually be able to do this for the entire fight. But yeah, this one probably is the easiest paths overall. You can really sort of cheese those ones I just mentioned. It has an Arcus boss, and unfortunately Symbiote Supreme and Doom will not work for him because anytime you gain a power gain, which they both will, I mean, that is if Dr. Doom is awakened, which is the way you want to fight Arcus. When they gain power gain, they actually turn into power drain. So you won't be able to utilize any of the abilities. But Clairvoyant is by far the best for this because it also has Power Shield. So when she gets to her special 2, it will just regen her back to full every time, and she totally keeps it in control. I'm also going to play a clip of Man-Thing totally manhandling this fight. That's also from Tafre that I mentioned earlier. And then while that clip is finishing out, I also just want to talk about the Rolk boss. He has Buffet, he has Power Focus 1, and he has a node where if you parry him, you get Disorient, which will eventually reduce your ability accuracy and your block proficiency. So it's a little tricky, but like because of the Buffet, any heal reversal option will work. And I'm going to roll a clip of a little bit of nostalgia for me here. I actually used Blade to get rid of him, and it was cool because, you know, I did Blade for my Labyrinth of Legends run, and there was a lot of Blade versus Rolk gameplay. I was getting really good at, you know, punishing his special ones with my special one and just getting into that rhythm. And the only thing that I had to worry about in this fight was not triggering Buffet. So yeah, I really had fun. Just, this is an example of like, you know, you could use a traditional option, or I was like, hey, I want to pull out the Blade and just give this one a go. So enjoy the rest of that clip as we move on to 7.1.4. Okay, so looking at 7.1.4, there's only 2 problems that I identified in this quest. Again, like I'm just kind of glancing over a lot of it so that we can just get to the problem fights. Weapon X is a little tricky. If you don't know how to fight him, I would recommend looking across YouTube to find some examples. But the 3 counters that I could think of to him are Archangel. You can pretty much shut him down just doing normal Archangel style. Warlock, if you get into a rhythm of like parry heavy with him, he will be regenning so much that, and you know, you're passive heal blocking him and power draining him the whole time, so he won't really be able to access his abilities. So yeah, Warlock always works, or certainly Quake. Like I mentioned in the intro, like I tried to not use Quake because she was a 5-star, but there were some times that I had to kind of throw the Hail Mary, and I will admit that I did need to Quake a lot of Weapon X because I messed up early on the first time. So yeah, Quake just completely works as well, and it's a very easy but long Quake fight. And we're just going to take a look at this other path, which is Armored Assault. And it also has that node from Alliance War where they have the enhanced armor, which can be a little tricky. So I chose to use Dr. Doom and just not make contact with them because they were unblockable so often. He has such a potent nullify on his special one and with the stagger that I found he worked really well, especially because I have a rank 3. But certainly an armor break champion, like even Silver Surfer I used a little bit here, can be very, very helpful. Or this may be one of those lanes that's a little bit trickier. You may have to use some items or rely on Ghost or Quake to take care of it so you don't have to make contact. But yeah, aside from this lane, there really isn't too much difficult in this 4th quest. And, you know, like I said at the beginning, like you don't have to use Ghost and Quake for everything, but of all the paths, I think this one might be one that you may want to go back to those old options if you're familiar with them, because they can most easily counter it if you're really good at playing either of them. So moving on to 7.1.5, there are a few problems in this quest. This may also be tied for the hardest quest overall, but there is, first of all, this unlimited power and buffet lane, which starts off with Terrax. And throughout this lane, there is a buff to Mystic Champions, where essentially your defender is going to be gaining a ton of Furies. And the way this Mystic node works is that it actually doesn't really allow you to nullify them, but it does allow you to place like a super huge poison on them depending on how many buffs they have. So eventually they're going to get to like 99 Fury buffs, and then when you throw a special attack, it puts this like gigantic poison on them, which is really cool. Now, I found Dr. Doom, or like whoever your favorite Mystic is, to work best for this path. However, the Terrax at the very beginning is a little tricky. So this is one of those examples of Ronin cheese that I was talking about. So you're going to see my Sig 40 rank 3 5-star Ronin just completely handle this fight in the background. And yeah, like I said, they're sort of always nice in MCOC history anytime you can Ronin cheese. So enjoy that fight. Of note, there's also a Do Not Go Gentle, which is that one where you need to land intercepts and heavy attacks from 6.2.5. And that one was a little annoying, but you know, it was a lot better that it was only one lane versus an entire quest of it. Let's just talk about 2 of the bosses. The Luke Cage Electro is probably one of the hardest bosses to deal with because it's one of the only ones that you need like a very specific counter for. There's no node that allows every champ to cover it. So the 2 nodes that make it annoying is, first of all, there's Combo Party, which can help. That gives you increased critical damage the more combo you have. But also there's this other node which every 10 hits, you're going to get a falter, which means your hits are going to miss. And when you miss, if you get hit, then your cruelty buffs disappear and you take a lot of direct damage. So like it's a bad combination unless if you're paying very, very close attention. So the conventional way to deal with this would be to pick an Electro counter because this Luke Electro does have the shock damage going back to you. So somebody who can counter Electro, like Guardian, for example, he takes very little energy damage, or Havoc or Omega Red. Those are sort of like the conventional ways to do it. And then, you know, you want to just watch out that every time you get to 10 combo, you're not going to falter. And then eventually your damage will go up and up and up with the cruelties and you'll be fine. Now you can also cheese it with Namor because it's basically Electro. And as we know, Namor will just like totally destroy Electro. So that's another way to deal with it. Or finally, what I ended up doing was using Quake because, you know, Electro, Quake is one of the best counters. So if you're comfortable quaking 600k HP, then go for it. I think that's also a very viable solution. And then very quickly, there's this Punishing Angel, which is like Angela, but it has the animations of Punisher with this new node called Mercy. This is similar to Black Widow, Deadly Origin node, but basically you want to be landing well-timed blocks, and then you dash back, and then that is when you can do your damage. So it also has one of those annoying 90% damage penalties. But the cool thing is when you activate the Mercy passive, you also get an 80% damage bonus for doing the node. So this is one of the few times where it's like you do get punished, but then you also get a little bit of a bonus when you do what it tells you to do, which is really nice. So I do really like that. The only annoying thing is if you're not comfortable with re-parry, again, a common theme, it does have Mighty Charge, which means in order to get those well-timed blocks, you probably will need to re-parry a few times. But again, this is a good fight to practice re-parry on. Just watch out for the block damage from the Punisher stuff, and you should be good to go. And finally, we've gotten to the last quest. As you can see, this one is kind of moving right along. But in general, I would say these lanes are also a little bit more straightforward than some of the harder quests. Just very quick highlights. Clapback Buffet. This is a Human Torch fest because every time you put on an Incinerate, you get a Smolder immediately. Also, there's a node that allows you to be basically immune to Buffet because you're immune to Nullify, and you also get a Fury on top of that. So, you know, any champ that won't debuff themselves from Clapback, like for example, don't throw a special one if you bring in Captain America Infinity War because the bleed will come back on you, will work totally fine. But I will say, because there's like Mr. Sinister and Ebony Maw and stuff, like they're very, very good Torch matchups. So if you do have Torch ranked, go there. We see the return of the Power Shield recharge lane, which is just like a Corvus sit in the corner and throw a special 2, or really any champ that has a big special 2, you can just hold block and get to that special 2. This also has the infamous Gamora lane with the Impatience node, which is pretty fun. You can check that out on YouTube. I know a lot of people like to use Gamora there because anytime you do not proc a buff based on RNG, you're going to basically gain a Fury buff. And, you know, Gamora has a chance to get a buff on just about every hit. So every time she doesn't, she will either proc the buff or get another Fury. So that works pretty well. Hyperion works for pretty much everything. You just have to be aware of small arms, which is going to hinder his heavy attack damage. And also, just of note, Darkhawk is a little bit of a tricky fight. Because if you're using Hyperion, for example, you know, you are basically knocking him down and dealing with your heavy having less damage every knockdown. And yeah, that one was a little tricky if you're using Hyperion. But I would recommend trying out Gamora. If you have the 6-star, it is a really fun time. And just to talk about 2 of these boss fights, I will just say really quickly that any of these mashup fights, they all have the same node, which is, first of all, they don't throw special 3s, which is really nice. So you never have to deal with that with the power control. But however, when they do get over 2 bars of power, they're going to start stacking prowess effects. And also they eventually have unblockable specials. So you do have to be aware of that. But because of that node, you can also Ronin cheese them, because as soon as they get over 2 bars of power, they're going to just start stacking and stacking. And so not all of them, like for example, the Electro Luke, you wouldn't be able to use Ronin because you'll just die. But yeah, and same with Ice Phoenix because of the cold snap. But in general, you know, you are able to Ronin cheese these, and if you wait long enough, you will be able to get Gwenperion down that way. However, I don't really recommend Ronin for her unless if you want to, because the node is basically, it's the same thing as the Kang boss, like that selective time stream, where as long as you shock or incinerate them, they won't regen, and it becomes a very, very straightforward fight where you do just bait out her specials and always try to have incinerate on them. However, you do need to read between the lines, because Gwenperion also has a node where if you do energy attacks, which would include like Human Torch or Dr. Doom, then, you know, she will regen a lot of that back. So you are going to be a little bit in trouble unless if you have someone who makes physical contact and incinerate. So the 2 options that I could think of that are best are Elsa Bloodstone, because she can have 100% incinerate uptime and she makes physical contact, or Gwenpool herself, because on that special 1, you're always going to have the incinerate, and as long as you just keep the bleeds up, she will have that incinerate up 100% of the time, and of course she makes physical contact. So yeah, Elsa Bloodstone or Gwenpool are wonderful for the Gwenperion or the Ronin cheese. And hey, Ice Phoenix is back. If you guys remember, the first time we saw Ice Phoenix was the very first Uncollected quest, the MODOK quest. She was like a really difficult Uncollected boss, mini boss at the time. But the funny thing is, that was also when we really weren't good at fighting Iceman, and there weren't very many cold snap immune champs, and now there are tons of them. So This is just a straight up Iceman fight. It just looks like Phoenix. And as long as you bring in somebody that can deal with a cold snap, you're going to be fine. So the three best options I would say are Ghost, Warlock, and Colossus. Because they all can deal with the cold snap. The one thing you do need to worry about is there's also encroaching stun, so you need to know how to deal with encroaching stun, but otherwise it's just a reskinned Iceman, which we've all been facing for years now, and you should be totally fine on that. All right, guys. Well, we made it to the end. Hopefully this wasn't too long. These are my thoughts on all of Act 7.1. I hope you guys enjoy it. If you have any additional questions, because I'm sure I left out lots of information and you may have found some other counters that you enjoyed using. If you have any of that, just let me know. Put it in the comments. I'd love to have a discussion about it. But yeah, overall, I had a really good time. Thanks for checking out this video, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.